Howdy folks! So welcome to the Breaking Tab workshop. If you're interested in learning how to break free of tablature and relatedly how to start moving towards learning to play the banjo by ear, which is essential for moving to the more intermediate and advanced stages of banjo playing, then you're in the right place. And if you do feel like you're stuck and having a hard time moving further in your playing and having a hard time getting away from tab in particular, or just learning by ear, don't feel bad. You're definitely not alone. And if you're still in the very earlier stages and haven't been at this long enough to become dependent on tab, then you're really in luck. I hopefully am about to save you a few years worth of heartache. And I think it's also important to know that it's not your fault. It's not because you're somehow an inferior musician that you're stuck. It's simply a natural and predictable consequence of how the banjo is usually taught. So for those of you who don't know much about me or about BrainJo, I'm Dr. Josh Turknet. I'm the founder of BrainJo. I've spent much of my life in the field of behavioral neuroscience. I have medical training in the field of neurology. And a long-standing interest of mine has been the subject of learning and neuroplasticity, or in other words, the science of how the brain changes itself, which is fundamentally the thing that supports learning of any type, including learning how to play the banjo. And I fully believe, and there's plenty of research now to support this, that anyone can learn how to play music well, since doing it rests on biological properties of our brains that we all share. And so learning how to play is simply a matter of understanding how to maximize our brain's ability to change itself. And I've played music in some shape or form since I was a kid. But I took up the banjo in my early adult years, and I started out learning Scruggs style banjo. And I used a lot of the traditional instruction methods that some folks may be familiar with. And at first it felt like I was doing really well. I was getting better quickly. I was putting in a lot of hours practicing or whenever I could. But then at some point I hit a wall, and I felt like I really couldn't move forward. And this became abundantly clear when I was in a workshop with a professional banjo player, and I tried to jam with him on a few tunes I thought that I knew well, and it completely fell apart. And it was at that point that I realized that the reason I'd failed was a direct consequence of my learning process, and that there were some glaring oversights in the way that things were typically taught, which was causing so many people to hit the same wall that I did. And a big piece of that was that the way in which tablature was being used in the instruction or in the learning process. So that experience was one of the early catalysts for me for what became the BrainJo method, which is an instructional method that uses the science of learning and neuroplasticity to allow anyone, regardless of their age or prior musical experience, to learn how to play music well. Like I said, I fully believe that anyone can learn to play the banjo or any musical instrument whatsoever well. But most who end up trying to do so end up not succeeding, and most people tend to conclude that that's a failure of aptitude, or that they just didn't have what it took to be musical or to play an instrument. And the reality is that your success depends entirely on how you go about learning, which means that the high failure rate when it comes to the banjo isn't due to banjo playing being something that only a select few can do well, but rather because of how it's usually taught, which leads to an ineffective learning process. So the BrainJo method for banjo is an entirely different way of teaching the banjo, designed to optimize the learning process, largely by designing it so that it fully capitalizes on the brain's ability to learn anything. And like I said earlier, a big piece of why so many people end up getting stuck and not making it where they want to go is because of the way in which tab is used in the learning process, which is going to be the subject of this workshop. And before I go any further, let me just say that I'm not against tab or written notation in general. Tab definitely has its uses. It's a useful communication tool, especially for people who like to learn visually. And it can also communicate certain concepts and ideas that can be otherwise difficult to convey, but can be easily represented visually. It's also something that allows beginning and early intermediate players to make good sounding music earlier on in their journey. And that's a really important thing. Being able to make good music and good sounds on your banjo is rewarding, and that's one of the things that keeps us motivated to keep pressing on and learning more. And furthermore, if you end up giving up, then this whole discussion is irrelevant anyways. Also, part of how much you use tab and whether or not you want to develop the ability to play by ear and completely free of tab really depends on what your goals are. So if your goals are just to play a handful of tunes on your back porch to pass some time or to entertain some friends and family, then sticking to tab may be just fine. On the other hand, if you want to move towards higher levels of musicianship, kind of beyond the early intermediate phase, be able to jam easily with others, create your own personal style of playing, and so on, then getting away from tab and developing your ear is really essential. So again, part of it just depends on your goals. I will say that being able to play by ear and to break free of tab, for most people, takes the amount of fun that they derive from the banjo to an entirely new level. And it greatly expands what you're capable of doing on the banjo. So, as I said earlier, I'm not against the use of it altogether by any means, and I use it in my own instructional materials for banjo. However, I'm very deliberate and particular about how I use it, and in particular am mindful to use it in a way that doesn't create dependency and that doesn't make it impossible for you to progress beyond an early intermediate level. So before we begin talking about the specifics of how you can start breaking free of tab, first let's just talk a little bit about the neuroscience of learning and particularly how it's applied to music and the banjo method. So, because I think it really helps to understand when we're breaking free of tab and figuring out a process for doing so, it helps to understand what we're trying to achieve in the brain itself. And there are really two central principles when it comes to the banjo method of instruction. The first principle is being mindful of how you practice, and specifically to practice in a way that stimulates the brain to change and that stimulates the change in the proper direction, or that makes it so the brain changes in the way we want it to. So a lot of what I've talked about in the Laws of Banjo series falls into this realm in terms of how to organize your practice sessions for maximum benefit and effectiveness. So you can have two people putting in the same number of practice hours, and one person progresses 20 times faster, not because he or she is more talented, but because they're using more effective practice techniques. So that's the first central principle, is to practice in a way that stimulates the brain to change. And then the second key principle is to be mindful of what the ultimate cognitive networks we're trying to build are. So if we take the brain of a beginning banjo player, someone who's never played before, they have no brain circuitry for banjo playing whatsoever. So none of us are born knowing how to do this. So all of the circuits for banjo playing must be created through practice. But in order to build a brain that does what we want to, we must be mindful of what those circuits we want to build actually do. And that greatly shapes the structure and sequence of the learning process. So both of those two principles are absolutely essential to success, yet they're often neglected entirely in musical instructional materials, or don't inform those materials at all. And what that often means is that the instruction material is organized in precisely the wrong way. So you may end up creating banjo playing circuits in the brain, but they don't actually do the thing that you want them to do. And that's why people end up getting stuck. And really, this workshop on breaking tab is focused on that second principle, which is making sure that when we practice, we're actually building the type of brain networks that we want to build, because ultimately our playing will be defined by the networks that we build. So to better understand the strategies I'm going to give you for breaking free of tab and developing your ear, it'll help for you to understand a few key ideas. So once again, the reason that it's hard right now to play without tab is because of the way in which you've learned so far. So you've built banjo playing networks in the brain that require tab to work. This isn't your fault. This is a predictable consequence of the way in which the instruction typically works. And most methods use tab as a shortcut to playing music, without doing anything to keep this from happening, where the tab gets integrated into your banjo playing circuits. So to break free of tab, what we need to do is build new networks that don't use tab. And in this workshop, we'll be talking about the steps to get there. And those new networks you'll be building will be totally different and will not require tab to operate. So right now, what you have, if you've learned from tab and if you find it hard to get away from it, are what would be known as vision to motor mappings in the brain. So basically networks that take visual data in the form of tablature and turn that data into a motor program for how to move your limbs, so that you can turn that tablature, that written notation, into music on your banjo. And that's exactly what you want to have if your goal is to learn to play music by rote. So if you're always playing with sheet music in front of you, like a classical musician, then these are actually the type of brain networks that you want to build. But that's exactly the wrong kind of network you want to have if you're a banjo player, because we don't use sheet music. We're not classical musicians. So what you want instead, if you want to build playing by ear networks, are what we call sound to motor mappings. So these are networks in the brain that map imagined sounds in the mind and then turn those or map those onto a motor program for moving the limbs, so that those imagined sounds then come out of our banjo. And the good news is that you can do this. It's simply a matter of structuring your practice in a way that supports it. It's also what the Brainjo method was designed for. The ultimate goal of the Breakthrough Banjo courses for fingerstyle and clawhammer banjo is to develop what I refer to as musical fluency, which is this ability to take imagined sounds in our mind and map those onto movements of the limbs so that we create music on the banjo. And we can transform the things in our mind into the sound of our banjo, and that's what we call musical fluency. So to get there, we have to build networks that don't have tablature as part of them in any shape or form. So let's review some of the things that you can start doing today to start this process of building your new tab-free banjo playing circuits. So the first strategy is just to be mindful of the way in which you learn songs from tab. So it is possible to learn songs from tab in a way that actually supports the creation of these sound to motor networks that we want, and that doesn't support the creation of these vision to motor networks that we don't want. And one of the early lessons in the Breakthrough Banjo course is on how to learn a tune from tab in this way, and refer to it as the 7-step tune learning process. And so here is that learning process from the course, and it's linked lower down on the page if you want to access it directly and read over it. I'm going to give you kind of the overview of the process. So like I said, the goal here is, if we are going to learn from tab, learn a song or whatnot, to do so in a way that actually supports our ultimate goal and creates the types of networks we want. So The first step is always to get the tune into your head. So one of the most common mistakes that's made is folks start trying to learn a new song from tab before they actually know how it goes or fully. So making sure you know what you're going to be playing is supposed to sound like before you set about learning the tune from tab is critical. This also requires developing some degree of musical memory, which is another important step, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the key here is don't try to learn to play something on the banjo unless you can sing or hum it or whistle it or whatever from start to finish. And then the second step is to learn the tune or the song from tab in chunks. So break it down into pieces and learn those pieces separately. And then with each chunk or piece that you learn, play through it without the tab as soon as you can. So the idea here is to learn the smallest chunk that you can then remember and play without looking at the tab, and don't move on to the next part of the learning process or the next piece in the tab until you can play what you've already learned from memory without having to look at the tab. The fourth step is to play the song along with an external timekeeping device. So anything that keeps regular time is suitable for playing along with. So the most traditional thing would be a metronome. I personally prefer to use backing tracks or even another musician if possible, as those help to develop additional aspects of musicianship beyond what the metronome can do. And I have different kinds of backup tracks as part of the course materials, and there's a sample of that as well on this page below, and you can take a look at those. So the idea here is to be able to play the tune that you've learned from start to finish along with a backing track without having to consult the tab. And if you do find yourself not remembering how a certain part goes or flubbing a certain part, then it's simply a signal to go back in the learning process and relearn that particular chunk and then test it again with some type of external timekeeping device. And what we're doing in this process of playing with an external timekeeper is checking to see whether or not the playing of the piece has become automatic, and that's a phenomenon that I talked about in some of the prior Laws of Banjo series, which is a critical piece in the learning process. So those are the 4 key steps. So again, to make sure you can hum or sing it from start to finish before you get started, then to break the tune down into chunks to learn, play those chunks without the tab as soon as you can, and then once you've learned the whole thing, play the song with some kind of external timekeeping device and see if you can make it through start to finish. It really doesn't matter the speed at which you do so. And then there are 3 additional bonus steps that I think are extra things that you can do that really further support the development of your ear and of musical fluency. So the 5th thing is to actually make a recording of yourself playing through the song. So again, speed doesn't matter at all here. Just play it through at whatever speed you need to play it cleanly and with good timing. And keeping a playlist of songs where you've done this is a good idea. The next step is then to listen to your recording, and while you're listening, just visualize yourself playing it. So just periodically listen back to the recordings that you've made of the songs that you know. And as you listen back, visualize yourself playing it. And what you'll likely find is that it's almost impossible not to do this with a song that you know how to play. So you'll almost automatically start seeing yourself playing it. So imagine yourself holding the banjo and what you're doing with your hands as the song is being played back. And if you're unable to see what to do with your hands throughout the entire song, so if there are parts you're saying, I don't really remember how I played that, then go back, revisit that song with the banjo to help fill in those memory gaps, and then continue to repeat that process until you can make it through the entire song listening in your mind and knowing what to play. And then the Last step is to visualize yourself playing the song without the recording. So now, rather than having the recording to listen to as a cue, just imagine, I'm going to play whatever, Blue Ridge Cabin Home from start to finish, and do so without the recording. So visualizing yourself making the movements of your hands that are needed to play the full song. And again, if you're unable to make it through this step from start to finish, then go back to the prior step where you're visualizing it with the recording, and then once you can do that again, move back to the final step 7. So like I said, this is a way to learn a piece from tab in a way that actually supports the creation of the networks that we want to build, which are these sound to motor networks. Because the only way that you can make it through step 7, the final step where you're visualizing from memory without a recording, is if you've built the networks in the brain that connect the movements of your hands to the sounds of your banjo, because that's the only way in which you could make it successfully through that final step. And what that also means is that you've created a brain network that works independently from tablature.